So most oracles out there, and there are some, and they are all doing a great job. They focus on the last mile. So basically, they're pulling from usually premium data sources, so companies who are pulling data from different markets, and they probably do this very well, and then they provide the oracle and feed it on chain. And then there's a consensus mechanism, usually on chain, that these different sources report the same asset. So there's a high emphasis on this last mile and trying to mitigate the potential attack vector from the Oracle smart contract itself, providing the dApp with a feed. I think this makes a lot of sense from an academic perspective, and I do believe it makes provides value to have a strong emphasis on the level of decentralization. I think from a practical perspective, it's very hard to actually know how decentralized a network of nodes is. No one can. Or it's very hard, I guess. I'm not 100% convinced. And by far more often, also there has never been a man-in-the-middle attack of a malicious Oracle contract feeding wrong data, at least not to my knowledge, in a relevant way. But usually problems or attacks derive from a feed which is possibly not wrong, but where people didn't understand the implications of what's the liquidity depth, what's the volatility of an asset, and how can this impact the dApp. So we don't focus only on the last mile to bring some data on chain in a very decentralized manner, but we believe it's critical to understand where does market data come from. Hence, we integrate in all major markets, being it centralized exchanges such as Coinbase or Binance, pulling every single trade of these markets, as well as decentralized markets. And we're not only pulling Uniswap data, which also these premium data providers do, but I would be extremely surprised, and this again is I think an issue when it comes to transparency. No one knows, or not no one, but it's not publicly available, which markets are actually included from these premium data providers. So we are running infrastructure that pulls DEX data, not only from Uniswap or SushiSwap on ETH, but on multiple L1s and L2s, Phantom, Near, Solana, Polygon, aggregating all these data sets on a single trade level. Hence, we are uniquely positioned to provide market data across many markets. So I think if you're looking for ETH or Bitcoin price, you can't go too wrong when looking at the top oracles. I think they're all providing a great product here. But when it comes to more exotic assets, which are native to different L1s or L2s, where majority of volume is traded on, let's say, an Orca, Solana DEX, we are uniquely positioned to provide these feeds. Still using industry best standards such as volume weighted average pricing, and we can adjust these methodologies because we get the data and we manipulate it based on what use case is trying to be served here. Is it used for assessing a collateral value and so on? So we go way beyond of what an oracle, I guess, traditionally, or the majority of oracles do. We go at the source of where the trade happens to provide the best possible feed.
That's a very good explanation. Thank you for that. And I think what comes through there a bit is also, if I remember correctly, most of your team or the original team had like a traditional capital markets background. And so you're familiar with the difficulty in pricing certain assets, and as you talked about market depth and all these things. So it's not only the price that matters in the end, that you simply hand over on what you described as the last mile, but actually being able to audit and to make an argument as to how you derive that price in the first place.
I think that there are some learnings from traditional markets. So how you build indices, which provides value and which you can take as a learning to DeFi. And at the same time, there's so much intransparency in traditional markets. So it's also quite intransparent where Bloomberg actually, which markets they take into account and which methodology is being applied. So I think we learned here from not only the benefits of what has been proven being very bulletproof when it comes to mathematical models and methodologies, but also the intransparency and how one can actually provide this transparency, which is in particular needed in DeFi because you can't reverse the trade, right? So this happened. So people need to be absolutely aware about the potential risks and where data actually derives from.
And what you described in like pulling all this information from centralized or decentralized exchanges, it's a huge expense to run it on a daily basis, and anybody who wants a new feed that needs to be built and the data needs to be cleansed. Obviously, there's a tokenomics model behind all of this, and so how does that work? What does the DIA token represent, and how are people rewarded if they contribute in certain roles to the delivery of that information?
Yeah, so DIA is a governance token. So this has been historically and is today really the focus of aligning interests of stakeholders across the community. At the same time, we set this up to really trying to provide to anyone who needs it transparent data. So there's no traditional paywall. People can access this data. Obviously, we have with clients for whom we build dedicated solutions, which and they contribute basically to the association's treasury. But the prime focus of DIA is the governance token. Looking into the future, we're using tools that incentivize the provision of different work, being it provision and approval of methodologies, participation in the DAO. So there are incentives and they're being rolled out over the next month. So there's a strong focus in pushing further the level of decentralization within DIA and to enable the stakeholders to contribute in various ways by proposing improvements, but also validating existing infrastructure. And this will be rewarded. So 2022, huge focus on bringing the DAO and the amount of stakeholders to the next level. We have taken quite some learnings how development, and we have 50 plus contributors here who actively contributed code to DIA and taking this to other verticals within the DAO. So.
Thank you. A few questions maybe on the data and data quality. So I think I saw on the website like two bubbles. One was open sourced and community verified data, and then next to it was a bubble that said like institutional grade data. And so how do you make the differentiation, and how do they differ in terms of what you provide?
They don't. So I think that's quite unique, and people find sometimes having a hard time to say, okay, we are using industry best practices from traditional finance and how you build an indices and having this Wikipedia open source approach. But I think it's on the contrary, extremely valuable, because the methodologies we're applying, yes, they provide institutional grade reference rates, but they are extremely transparent, and we involve the community in validating and contributing to these methodologies. So this is a combination of both, and it's not exclusive for either one.
Lastly, if we're talking about blockchain DeFi, we also need to talk about the Metaverse and NFTs, and you're also doing something in that space. And when I've read this first, like, what's the role that oracles have in NFTs and the Metaverse? So what's happening there?
Yeah, I mean, the Metaverse, however you want to define it, and I think it's still up to discussion. It's kind of the glue, the connectivity between different technologies. So I think we're moving now from, not moving away, but we're adding to a financial layer we created with DeFi as an industry, which enables transfer of value, usage of financial products to expand what Web3 can actually offer to its users. Not everybody's like just fascinated by options. So I do believe that we'll have a large influence. We saw this with NFTs when it comes to something related to art or communities or collectibles. This is relevant to a much broader audience, and this is all somehow connected, possibly through the Metaverse, where then you have a virtual world where you interact, where you do transactions, where you need to borrow money, or where you want to invest, and where you hold certain assets which represent whatever you're wearing, possibly, or some other use case. So it's just, I guess, it's just an additional layer and stack. And oracles are also relevant when it comes to NFTs. So, I mean, they are just non-fungible, which makes it a bit more difficult to assess, I guess, the value. We see this, and I guess we see this in the markets due to the illiquidity. Nonetheless, oracles are needed when it comes to assessing a price, or, for example, providing randomness, which is in gaming and NFTs often use. So yes, for these reasons, we are very active in the space. We see a lot of growth, as I guess everybody sees. So we're quite excited about it. And as you were mentioning, we also are using this. We're not only serving this new emerging growing verticals within the industry, but we're also using the tooling for our product. So we created DRRs, kind of like on an alpha release basis. What do ARCs do? So they are a utility NFT. We use them basically for something which hasn't been addressed neither in the traditional nor in the DeFi space, is how do you go about the usage of licenses when it comes to data streams? So who knows where does the data come from? And was one allowed to actually use it to, for example, create a fee which can then be used for a dApp on such and such protocol, or, for example, an index. And ARCs basically represent single data sets. So they're pointing to the source, and they also point to the definition of IP associated to such data sources when present. When not, basically the owner of the data source can claim the source token and adjust the rights associated to it, and then you have an audit trail on such rights. So it brings transparency where data comes from, and if it was in which way allowed to use. At the same time, ARCs are kind of an incentive mechanism for us to identify and for our stakeholders to participate in creating new and requesting new data sets, because there's a ranking hierarchy with ARCs. So when you mint one of the initial batch, depending on their rank, this influences the eligibility on a pool which is being filled by people who are minting the same data set over time. And the more people will mint this R token using a dApp to validate that they were allowed to ingest the data set, the more is in this pool. And so if you strongly believe in a certain data set, you're probably incentivized to be early, to request it in the forum, to be added, and so on, and then minted. Having said that, it's quite early days. We set the foundation for this for certain assets. We'll roll this out. We have a couple of updates coming very shortly on the utility of the arts. Yeah, so we're quite excited about that.